Welcome, all of you, to the second presentation of our series on crossing borders, leaving home, making new lives, and sustaining communities. The program is sponsored by the Georgetown Americas Forum, co-sponsored by the Georgetown Americas Institute, and we thank both for all their support and assistance. I'm John Tutino. I am a professor in history who studies Mexico, its communities in the world, and have the pleasure of serving as director of the Americas Forum. Let me remind that this webinar will be recorded and will be posted on the events page of the Americas Institute website. And the timeline is said to be soon. What I'm happy to report is that the recording of our first session last week with Larissa Veloz is now up on the website for any of you who want to see it or return to it. Let me then remind our audience that the last 15 or 20 minutes will be devoted to engaging questions from the audience. At that point, please be sure you have opened the Q&A box on your computer. And if you will please type in your questions, we will move to them as we can. With formalities passed, I'm pleased to say that today's presentation is by Mireya Loza, and it is entitled A Century of Mexican Guest Workers in U.S. Fields. Mireya completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, an MA in anthropology at the University of Texas in Austin, where I need to editorialize, that's a program that impacted my life powerfully while I was pretending to be a student in history at the University of Texas. The anthropologists there warped my mind in the best of ways. So it's a great engagement. She then went on to complete a PhD in American Studies at Brown University, to then teach in food studies at New York University, before she joined us at Georgetown as an associate professor of history and American Studies in 2021. During the last several years, while at NYU and also here at Georgetown, she has simultaneously been a curator at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. Thus, she has been able to do what few can, which is merge cutting-edge scholarship with effective public history. Her book, Defiant Braceros: How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2016. And shortly thereafter, it won the Theodore Salutis Prize of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. I could go on, but I'll simply conclude saying Mireya's arrival has strengthened Georgetown in uncountable ways. And both here and beyond, her visions have illuminated so many important issues, as you will now get to discover. Mireya.
Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. I am really excited about basically talking about some new research. I should say thank you, John Tutino, for inviting me, and also the Americas Forum and the Americas Institute for basically arranging all of this wonderful series. I am the second, but there will be more to come, so stay tuned. I will share my screen now and my PowerPoint. So let me start by saying I have been thinking about guest workers for a very long time, and I recently started thinking a lot long and hard about the period that came before the Bracero program and basically periods after the Bracero program. So for this talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of my new research, and I will also probably not tell you as much about braceros, but guess what? I wrote a book on that, so y'all can check it out. I'll start today by telling you a little bit about some of the first guest workers. On Friday, August 17, 1917, 22-year-old Delfina Rubio de Preciado made her way to Nogales, Arizona with her 34-year-old husband, Margarito Preciado, and their 2-year-old daughter, Eustolia. There she is. They traveled about 1,000 miles from their home in Etzatzlan, Jalisco to Cananea, Sonora before crossing into the US. At the border, they were issued an identification card that authorized them to work in agriculture. They were recruited to work for the sugar beet employer Sugar Lime Rock Company in Los Angeles, California. Even though little Eustolia would not be issued an identification of her own, her tiny round face appeared prominently near her mother's ID photo. Immigration officials in Nogales noted that Delfina was penniless and illiterate, but the pressing need for agricultural workers compelled the Secretary of Labor to suspend the 1917 Immigration Act for Mexicans recruited to work in areas impacted by perceived labor shortages brought on by World War I. Ultimately, women like Delfina were encouraged to join their spouses, enabling both of them to enter the US as guest workers accompanied by their child. Women like Delfina became part of the first ad hoc recruitment of Mexican guest workers. And while the Foreign Act, also known as the Contract Labor Law, prohibited any company or individual from bringing in unskilled immigrants under contract, officials looked past this, perhaps because ideally Mexicans would not only return to Mexico, but leave very little traces of their time in the US. And while the agricultural depression and the Great Depression would make the need for Mexican guest labor obsolete for a brief period, World War II and the expansion of agribusiness in the post-war period would ignite growers' continued desire for a flexible, expendable workforce. During the largest guest worker program in American history, the Bracero program, growers managed over 4.5 million contracts between 1942 and 64. The program came to a close after congressional hearings exposed the exploitation workers faced, but Mexican guest workers didn't stop coming to the US. Instead of the Bracero program, growers looked to the H-2 program, which was originally used to recruit workers from the British West Indies to work on farms along the East Coast. Growers across the US continued to access Mexican labor, and many loudly repeated the same arguments used in 1917 about the effectiveness of Mexican workers and the lack of interest in these jobs by American workers. What they did is obscure the reality that they in fact had kept salaries low, the work conditions and the housing terrible, so terrible that any citizen with other work options would indeed leave the fields. As historian Cindy Hahamovich argues, the US government became, in a sense, a padrone or a crew leader, supplying foreign workers to owners and managers of the nation's farms. The rising need for a flexible workforce in agriculture in America required naturalized racial linkages between migrants and labor. As US agricultural employers sought the ideal temporary worker across various continents, it settled on Mexican labor as the perfect workforce to complement the conditions of food production in America. Today, I'm going to provide you with snapshots of the first Mexican guest worker program and the contemporary H-2A visa program. I'll briefly speak about Braceros in between. On May 23rd, 1917, Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson waived the immigration head tax of $8 and the literacy test requirement, and soon thereafter, labor recruiters made their way to the border in order to procure Mexican workers. Additionally, he categorized these workers as non-immigrant, which became the basis for his exemption. Though the Department of Labor instituted many rules, many officials on the ground noted both the chaos and malleability of the program. Employers, labor recruiters, border agents, and other government officials shaped how Mexicans would be recruited, processed at the port of entry, and transported to their work site. Labor contractors would make their way to the port of entries such as, let's say, El Paso or Nogales, Arizona, and they'd entice workers to go with them by promising basically high salaries, comfortable housing, and a return transportation if they disliked the condition. So they literally said, if you don't like it, you can go back home and we will facilitate that. We will pay for that. Once at the work sites, migrants found themselves laboring for low wages, living in terrible conditions, and saddled with the transportation bill. If they refused the job, they were threatened with jail time or deportation. In the first few months of the program, some of the largest agricultural employers of imported Mexicans were the cotton and the sugar beet industries. Let me tell you a couple of the stories of these workers who came in through the program. On October 1st, 1917, Maria Jesus Martinez, here she is, traveled from Lagos de Moreno, Jalisco, to El Paso, Texas, with her husband of 10 years, Juan de Arco, and her 2 children. The small stamp on her identification specified that she was assigned to the Arkansas Valley Labor Association, and their destination was Rocky Ford, Colorado, to work in the sugar beet industry. She was in this first group to come to the area that fall, making the long journey with her 7-year-old Maria and her 8-month-old Roberto. While Roberto would have been too small to work in the fields, Maria would have been a great asset, and she could actually contribute to her family income. When women and children pick crops, the weight in pounds would be added to the head of the family. Entering through this program would contractually tie workers to one particular employer or to a growers association, which meant that they could essentially work on several farms. Furthermore, as the text on the back of her ID states, the alien to whom this card is issued must not engage in any other than agricultural pursuits. Engagement in labor of any other character will render him liable to deportation. It's interesting that it says him because clearly it's a her, but they imagined that the majority of the workers would be men. This effectively locked families into place unless they deserted. Basically, deserting is opting to leave your work site and become an undocumented worker rather than continue under the terms of your contract. And from the very beginning, agricultural employers were concerned with workers deserting their jobs in search of better prospects. In the first year, the Arkansas Valley Labor Association and the Holly Sugar Company of Colorado brought in 617 workers, of which approximately 67% eventually went missing or deserted. Although employers attempted to pursue deportation for those who left their jobs, these workers could be hard to track down and could cost as much as $120 to deport, money that growers were unwilling to spend. Ironically, they really pursued other means and government involvement for deportation. They themselves didn't want to assume the cost, but they wanted the government to assume the cost. Spreckels in the cases where they wanted to track down these workers. Spreckels Sugar Company in Salinas, California, also became so concerned with desertion that they employed deputy sheriffs day and night to guard agricultural laborers employed in the beet fields. In many ways, they held their labor captive. Their surveillance proved effective as they had one of the lowest desertion rates. One journalist reported, and I quote, "It's improbable that it would have been deemed necessary to keep an armed guard at the plant to prevent desertion if there was not some grounds for belief that the imported men were discontent and perhaps the company was not living up to the terms of their agreement." An agriculturalist shed light on the situation in a congressional testimony stating, quote, "They put guards there and had those guards deputized by the sheriff of the county, and they made it a rule that they would not let the employees in or out unless they had permission to do so." Despite this assertion, as the testimony continued, bigger questions emerged as to whether limiting the movement of these workers constituted a type of peonage, an accusation that those involved in the beet industry vehemently denied. From the very beginning, many workers pushed back. Workers, including women, actively questioned the management of the program. In March 1917, the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company recruited a group of workers who, upon the completion of the term of their contracts, refused to sign a contract extension because it was written in English. Gabriela Ruiz, age 33, accompanied by her 44-year-old husband, Severiano Betancourt, and their 4 children, refused to sign. You're going to ask, how can their 4 children refuse to sign? Children above 16 were issued IDs Children under 16 were not. And they had one child, Francisca Betancourt, who was barely 16, but she also joined her parents and refused to sign. She was pressured by the company, but she joined the list of 105 workers who did not comply, 41 of which were women. The Utah-Idaho Sugar Company had come under scrutiny when workers complained about terrible housing, wage deductions, and basically additional costs of transportation being tacked on to their wage deductions. While the initial contract they signed was in English, several workers in this group, including Gabriela and Francisca, insisted that the contracts be written in Spanish. A verbal interpretation would not suffice. While it was common for men to skip out on their contracts and find work on the railroads, mining, or in construction, because in this first guest worker program, these industries could also apply and be allowed to recruit workers. By and large, the largest industry was agriculture. But these would have been closed off to women. Women might find work basically in the peripheries of railroad, perhaps making meals or doing laundry, but they themselves would not be official workers on the railroad. One inspector who visited company housing, basically the company housing in the Utah Sugar Company, several months later, basically reported that 50 families and 8 children under the age of 16 were living in this company housing for a total of 200 people. The little houses or boxes provided by the sugar company for residents, he stated, are designed for one family of 4 or 5 persons, but it was not uncommon to find double the occupancy. This is quite a problem because the Spanish influenza was running rampant, and these close quarters that workers basically were put in were definitely difficult sites to keep from spreading the Spanish influenza. Worst of all, many of the companies would basically pay for half of the fare for those who signed these contracts or had officially been recruited with these IDs, but the full fare for the remainder of the family members would be something that they would have to raise on their own, effectively making it too costly for migrants to return. So in the case of families that had 3 children under 16 or 4 children under 16, they were expected to bear the brunt of that cost. This was perhaps too much for the Betancourt family to bear, and by December 17, 1918, they deserted. The company noted that 31 Mexicans deserted with them, 15 adults, 7 men, 8 women, 16 children. So quite a large group that they reported. Guest worker families in the cotton industry also experienced exploitative labor practices. On September 20th, 1919, 2 couples arrived in Nogales, Manuel and Guadalupe Cota and Manuel and Dolores Cota, with their 2 children, Jose, 6, Manuela, 3. It's not clear by the historical record or through the record that they're related. They were recruited, I think it's highly likely, but I'm not positive. They were recruited to work by the Arizona Cotton Growers Association just in time for the fall picking season. It's likely that little Jose and Manuela would have also worked in the fields. One cotton farmer who employed Mexican guest workers explained, quote, "When I'm speaking of Mexicans, I'm speaking of everything from 3 years old and up, because they all work under contract." The farmer imagined that the entire family was bound by contract, which they were, if not by law, then by custom. After the 1919 season, Manuel and Dolores went back to Mexico, but returned the following year, this time with their 3rd child, 8-month-old Genaro. Let me show you a picture of Dolores Cota. They entered the field in the midst of a labor dispute that culminated in 1920, when about 4,000 temporary laborers demanded a pay increase from the Arizona Cotton Growers Association. Workers' wages had been kept low by the growers' associations, which charged them also for the cost of transportation and made them basically buy from the employer-owned commissary. This system really kept these workers deeply in debt. The remainder of the workers were labeled as strikers, which really got the growers off the hook for basically transporting them back to Mexico. They solely claimed that these people who were striking broke the terms of their contract first. So they were not liable. They were not on the hook for transporting them back to Mexico. The Arizona Growers Association were also allowed to recruit labor almost immediately, which really demonstrates the power that they had, not only to end contracts, to deport workers, to cancel contracts on their whim, but to do all of this with no government scrutiny and continue to bring temporary workers. By the beginning of 1921, the Mexican consul estimated that more than 24,000 migrant laborers found themselves stranded and under severe economic duress. The problem facing indigent workers reached the ears of Mexican President Álvaro Obregón, who on February 16, 1921, ordered the transfer of 250,000 pesos to the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, the SRE, to facilitate the repatriation of all Mexicans in poverty or unemployed in the US, and to create a department of repatriation. When over 10,000 Mexicans found themselves destitute in Arizona's Salt River Valley, Representative William Berry of Miami, Arizona, critiqued the Growers Association by sharing that many of the Mexicans were, quote, unable to collect the wages due to them, and that men, women, and children were without shelter and clothing, and the majority of them were left without sufficient food. Cotton growers were quick to defend their limited liability when it came to Mexicans by claiming that the root cause of the problem was the declining price of cotton. It's agricultural, basically the recession that hit right after World War I. By 1921, the Mexican consul secured $17,000 from the Mexican government to assist these families in repatriation. But this money secured by the consul was insufficient, and the Arizona Immigration Commissioner had to obtain permission to use federal road equipment to help transport these workers. They transported 250 people on 4 trailer trucks across the Nogales border, while an additional 1,600 registered for repatriation. Well, we may never know if Manuel and Guadalupe were in that group repatriated on those trailers. What we do know is that they departed from the US through Nogales on Sunday, March 13, 1921, amid local pressure to leave the state. 4 months later, 4 months, not very long, the cotton growers once again began their search for low-wage exploitable labor by sending their agents to Tucson and Nogales. The Secretary of Labor renewed this temporary program after the conclusion of the war into the 1920s. However, by then, labor organizations loudly argued that there was no labor shortage in the US. Moreover, American laborers were competing with Mexicans who they argued would accept lower wages. Growers voiced a different opinion, claiming that Americans were reluctant to return to agriculture, again, in part because they had successfully kept the wages low and the conditions really terrible. And while American citizens also worked as agricultural laborers, this discourse was used to justify the employment of both Mexican undocumented and temporary workers. The Secretary of Labor granted extensions of recruitment and contracting of Mexicans past March 2nd, 1921 for really special cases, but most employers were asked to basically facilitate the return of their workers to Mexico. And as you know, or as you may guess, this request was largely ignored by many growers. And these workers that were stranded became basically seen as a nuisance to the communities they lived in. In short, the once needed laborers had become expendable. Shortly after this program, Mexicans faced the massive deportation and repatriation brought on by the Great Depression. But World War II would ignite the same discussion of labor shortage in agriculture by growers that we saw in World War I. And although I'm not going to dive deeply into the Bracero program, there are many lessons learned from the first Mexican guest worker program that were either applied or done away with in the second program, the largest program, the Bracero program. For example, in the Bracero program, the power of the growers' associations increased as they played a more central role in the management of these guest workers on the ground. The Temporary Workers Savings Fund was formalized, which was a feature of the first guest worker program. It's basically a savings account that was supposed to be given to these workers when they returned to Mexico. This was basically standardized in the second Mexican guest worker program, the Bracero program. And the search for the ideal body was standardized through medical inspections of the workers at the border. Women and children were no longer included. Women's ability to give birth to children who would have claim to American citizenship presented a problem. And by the 1930s brought on major changes for the protection and education of children. Although children could continue to work in agriculture, there were many advocates of children's welfare that not only wanted to see children not work in fields or in industry, which they succeeded in industries, but they also wanted more access to public education for these children. In addition, during this first guest worker program, growers learned how to utilize strategic noncompliance and manage migrants in ways that deployed that threat and that power of deportation. 100 years after the first Mexican guest workers set foot in US fields, a whole 100 years, the Munger brothers with farms in California and Washington came under scrutiny on August 3rd, 2017, when 28-year-old Ernesto Ibarra, an H-2A worker, collapsed after repeatedly asking for medical help and for attention days before. For many, many days, he had been going to middle management and asking for medical attention and saying that he didn't feel well over and over. He pled with management. He pled with anyone who listened to the fact that he was not feeling well. A supervisor explained to Don Ibarra that he had huevonada, and he was told, vete a cosechar. Basically, you're lazy and go harvest. Immediately, workers began to protest because they saw his hospitalization and eventual passing as a product of deep neglect, and alleged that the supervisors and management could and should have done more for him. In the days after their protests, the day after his death, they protest, workers voiced their dissent. These workers were placed on a bus traveling to the nearest town because management had decided to terminate their contracts and to begin an employer-led deportation. Luckily, locals and activists noted their movement and asked them not to board the second bus that would take them back to Mexico. And instead, these activists brought them back, and these workers camped out on people's lawns in public areas and basically were able to start speaking back and protest their unfair treatment. Let me show you some images. This is the workers basically on a typical day in the Munger farms. This is basically their protest August 8, 2017, near Saraban. I love this sign, we are farm workers and human too, as if the fact that they're not workers in their case doesn't signify to most people that they're human. Here we see them camping out. They literally took over people's front lawns and spaces in which they could basically stay for a while. People took out food not only for them, but also any camping equipment that they had, any sleeping bags, to help them stay there and to help them stand up to their employer. This is what it looked like, and they began to hold meetings and organize. They raised attention to the fact that they were not being fed well, often subsidizing their meals with processed food that they would obtain the few times they'd go into the town and be taken to the store. They'd basically purchase whatever highly processed food they could put in their backpack, they could have in their limited living quarters. They were not given breaks. They complained that they were not given also enough water. And when they actually brought these issues up to management, they were often told that if they didn't like it, they could go back to Mexico. The workers believed that all of these factors led to Don Ibarra's decline. The reality is also that they didn't also have enough power in this situation. They relied on these contracts and did not want to get blacklisted and wanted to be able to obtain a contract the following year. Guadalupe Tapia explained, no teníamos la suficiente agua ni suficiente sombra cuando era el descanso. We didn't have enough water or shade when we took breaks. On the day they were thrown out, Tapia explained, nos amenazaron con echarnos la policía, la inmigración. They threatened us with calling the police and immigration. They eventually secured legal representation and decided to return to Mexico as the case played out in court. 600 workers across Mexico and the US joined the class action lawsuit. Columbia Legal Service, the law firm that represented these workers, called on my expertise in guest worker programs in order to provide an expert witness assessment of their treatment. This is a one time where, as a labor historian, I was like, I have power to be an expert witness on this subject. And of course I did, because essentially I knew how these programs work and basically how this structure basically facilitates intentional neglect. I was lucky enough to get a chance to talk to some of these men about their aspirations, their work conditions, and their deep sense of vulnerability, especially the deep sense of vulnerability that came over them when Don Ibarra passed away. As many of them said to me, that could have been me. I don't want my kids to basically have me come back in a body bag. And so they continuously said, that could have been me, that could have been any of us. In 2019, Munger Farms decided to settle, but not admit to any wrongdoing. They would pay $2.5 million in back wages. They agreed not to seek H-2A workers for 3 years. Ultimately, Munger Farms also came to the table and settled with the workers when they realized that CSI Visa Processing Company, which is the processing company that they use to recruit and bring in these workers and arrange for the visas for these workers, had not filed the paperwork correctly that would allow them to transport workers from California to Washington. Essentially, they could be charged with human trafficking. Munger Farms, based in California, is one of the largest blueberry producers in North America. The company partners with Nature Ripe to sell blueberries at your grocery chain. And you know these grocery chains, Costco, Walmart, Whole Foods. You might actually now go and pay attention and see and say, whoa, those are Nature Ripe. The experience of these workers reveals the real problem with guest worker programs. Power is so asymmetrical that workers can't stand up for themselves when their labor rights or their human rights are violated. Since this incident, the number of Mexican guest workers has only risen. Let me show you a slide. That is basically the number of H-2A visas issued in 2021. And you can see how this number has risen. From 2013 to 2021, the number has grown basically threefold. Right now, we basically have a little over 250,000 Mexican guest workers coming in. You're going to say, how do you know these guest workers are Mexican? About 93% of these visas are issued to Mexicans. That's a whole lot. Just for comparison, let me show you basically how many braceros were admitted during the duration and life of the Bracero program. You could say that we are basically at the equivalent of the early 1950s in terms of recruitment of Mexican guest workers. The height of the Bracero program, we have a little under 500,000, but as it gears up towards that, we do have many years that are very, very close to basically the 250,000 mark. As policymakers, representatives of agribusiness, and farm worker advocates debate the Farm Worker Modernization Act of 2021, which essentially would provide undocumented farm workers a long path to becoming documented while also dramatically expanding guest worker visas, labor organizations are divided on the issue. The Food Chain Workers Alliance argues that the bill expands a flawed H-2A program and that the legal path to citizenship is limited, complex, and excludes many current farm workers, while the United Farm Workers celebrates this act as an advancement of immigrant rights. In both the first Mexican guest worker program and in the contemporary H-2A program, growers continue to utilize strategic non-compliance and manage migrants in ways that not only deploy this power of deportability, but also basically they exercise their muscles in hiring management that continues to basically tell these workers that if they don't like these conditions, they need not apply the following year. Perhaps the most important aspect of these guest worker programs is that it normalizes the expectation that growers can control laborers' movements across borders, control their movement in the US camps, and that there's no need for farm workers to be year-round, permanent, and full-fledged members of the communities they work in. This deep-rooted legacy has come to shape the lives of contemporary guest workers as they labor outside the purview of most Americans. This dependence on Latinx immigrants in agriculture is not simply a product of geographic proximity or poverty. It was not inevitable. It was created by design through policy and grower influence. This concludes my talk, and I'm happy to chat some more and take questions.
So again, I will thank you, Mireya, for a wonderful talk. I will remind everyone to please open your Q&A, and if you type in questions, we will present them in a second. While folks move in that direction, I would love to sort of almost pick up on your final points there, which are really create all kinds of large questions. And I guess it goes something like this. In the mind of most observers, we have been trained to think about the Bracero program as something linked to World War II, the 40s, that, oh, it happened to continue until it was finally done away with. And yet, the chart you showed, the actual presence of formal braceros was, shall we politely say, modest during the war, important, but modest, whereas it truly peaks in the 1950s. And since the end of the Bracero program in 64, H-2A has been if not the primary means of recruiting temporary agricultural workers, I'll politely say more or less legally. What the statistics clearly show is that we are living the peak. And I'd love to hear your reflections on the two peaks. From both sides of the border. Why the peak in the 50s? What might it have to do with Mexico? What might it have had to do with the US? And then why the current peak?
Well, the 1950s also shows it's a booming age, and you know a bit about this as well. It's an age of really this adoption of, not that it hadn't been before, but these great leaps in agricultural science, in fumigants, pesticides, insecticides, and the technology that would facilitate basically the need for more agricultural workers. So we have basically larger and larger farms, larger and larger and larger and larger farms. And often I say agribusiness because it's no longer this one farmer that's tending to his farm, but it's basically this giant business of farming. Mm-hmm. And so you need the workers for that, but you also have basically lots of interesting things happening in the 1950s. You have the Bracero program existing in the 1950s alongside, initiatives like Operation Wetback. And so you have this double-edged sword where folks are coming in as documented workers, but you also have this mass expulsion happening amidst all of that, right? And so I think it's complicated, and those are the kind of things that I'm trying to tease out for my next book project, but they're also things that I'm constantly thinking about. If we really compare what is happening right now, I mean, we could say this is similar to the numbers that were coming in the basically early 1950s, when it peaks is in sort of the mid 1950s. But let's say this is more similar to 1950, 1951. And no one seems, at least in my mind, concerned that we're definitely reproducing lots of the elements of the Bracero program in the H-2A program.
And I'm just going to put an interesting, because you're absolutely right about the simultaneous rapid, what I like to call mechanization and chemicalization of agriculture. And it cranks up production while making most employment seasonal. The intriguing consequence, which I'm just going to toss out there because I got no answers to, overall, there's an expulsion from Mexico and the recruitment in the US. But there is this shift to the temporary as a way to survive.
I will tell you an anecdote about that. My father
Please.
always claims that he initially left Mexico because all he really wanted was to earn enough money to purchase a tractor. That's what his dream was, to purchase a tractor. And every once in a while, I pull his chain and ask him, where's the money for the tractor? Because now he's settled in the US for, since his arrival in the 1960s.
Now I'm going to make perhaps a bad joke. Has he ever tried to respond, well, I may have failed to buy the tractor, but I found a life for you?
Oh, definitely. He says, I don't have a tractor, but I have a daughter with a PhD.
All right. So he's found some positives in living without the tractor. All right. Thank you. We're starting to get questions, so I'm going to step back and to the first one up from Clayton Daniker, who, yes, the recording will be posted in a couple of days. I'll just leave that one there for you. To Brody Lohman, I presume it's Lohman, to what extent did poverty worsen or impact many of the migrant workers during this period? Were there any exceptional event stories of workers that were spurred on by this aspect of financial poverty?
Can you read the question?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry.
No. It's sort of at the center of what you've been talking about. To what extent did poverty worsen or impact many of the migrant workers during this period? Were there any exceptional events or events or stories of workers that were spurred on by this aspect of financial poverty? What he doesn't quite suggest, I'm guessing Brody's a he, it could be a she. Anyway, is the issue, is it poverty at departure lives? Is it poverty here in the fields? But
yeah, I mean, the part of it is that many of these workers come in because they seek a better salary, right? They need basically to make a decent salary to support their families. But I think the issue at hand that we keep seeing with these guest worker programs is that, in order to make that salary, you have to demonstrate that you're a docile worker so that you can continue to get these guest worker contracts. During the Bracero program, I mean, growers who could not demonstrate that they were docile basically were done away with quickly. And there were symbols of that, right? For a lot of growers, they thought, men from the city won't do because they are, smart, shisty, also might be too worldly. So they often thought of people from rural areas as people that could be more easily manipulated. And so they sought out actively people who didn't have sometimes high levels of literacy. And I remember one story with a bracero who had been a college student and had been a college student in agriculture. Again, the Green Revolution, he's trying to learn all about the new agricultural technology being implemented in Mexico. And so he, as a student, decides that he can't afford to be a student any longer and wants to become a bracero. He makes his way to the border with all of his books and his school material because he wants to continue to study when he is in the fields. And basically immigration officials and folks in these contracting centers asked him if he was a communist, a rabble rouser, because the literacy disturbed them, that he was so highly literate and that he had basically a knapsack of books. And so I think, poverty is definitely one part of the story, but I also think that the active recruitment of these families is the other part of the story. And so in the first guest worker program, what we find is these contractors are also shisty, and they say, you will make good money, you will, bring back dollars, and you will live a good life. And if you don't, we will take you back to Mexico, and that's not a big issue. And they find themselves stranded. And so, I mean, the story of poverty is always a story that is, is entwined into these, discussions with these workers. I mean, one reality, at least in the H-2A program, is that people are relying on these contracts. And so they basically try to demonstrate that they are docile so that they can secure a contract the next year and the following year and the following year after that. And the other part of the story that we don't read about is that for many of them that were farm workers, especially maize, basically maize cultivators, I mean, they were hit hard by NAFTA. And so part of it is US policy as well that's driving folks to find better opportunities.
Yeah. I will again side comment. Oh, now that same student can come across with a tablet he can hide in his backpack and probably get away with it, whether he's a serious student or coming to organize workers. A little advice for either attempt these days. You have no need to comment on that. From Diana Neria, what region of Mexico did most braceros come from? Did braceros come from all over Mexico, or was there a particular area of Mexico which they were coming from?
Braceros actually came from all of Mexico. I mean, if you'd like, I can show you this very quick map here. And then I'll stop the share. So they basically came from all of the blue states. The light blue states are sending states. All of the dark blue states are receiving states. So they came from all parts of Mexico. But the reality is that the largest sending states, the ones that sent the most numbers, are basically these states here: Jalisco, Guanajuato, Michoacan. And you can still see the legacy of what these folks that were from these states have done, in that you basically can't go to a major Mexican metropole in the US without there being a Club de Michoacán, de Jalisco, de Guanajuato, because they basically built community in the US.
Okay, thanks. From Dennis Gilbert, Your Father's Tractor. Studying small Mexican merchants in 1970, I ran into more than a few who had put together a little capital working as bracero. How typical was this?
There's always success stories in the bracero story. There are some braceros, not very many. So what I'm talking about are definitely people who are on the fringes. The success stories are few and far between. But say, for instance, the Secretary of Labor, the ex-Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis, her grandfather was a guest worker, a bracero. And not only was he able to find for his children some upward mobility, but there are at least one vineyard in Napa in Sonoma that is owned by a ex-bracero who learned basically the craft and the trade, and then basically got in on the ground before Napa and Sonoma became so expensive. But he learned how to work with grapes as a bracero. So there are very few success stories, but there are the more common success stories are people who move into middle management and find paths to becoming citizens or residents. And those middle management are basically the folks that begin to not only bring in braceros to manage them, but also are some of the folks that facilitate the exploitation as well.
Yeah, I will. There's a sequence that I have run into that I will just add to this conversation, which is, while I think you're absolutely correct that those who succeeded are a minority, right? Mm-hmm. And those who succeeded, some end up bringing that success to home communities. Others end up bringing that success or developing it somewhere in the US. But there is this repeated case where the bracero who succeeded with your dad's dream of the tractor or the pickup truck, mm-hmm. There are variations of that, or the taxi, a car who mm-hmm. uses a taxi, ends up not a big shot, but ends up sort of a prosperous fellow in a small Mexican town. And he ends up better off than most of his peers, but not that well off. And I've often wondered if that cycle visible may have still impacted others coming over time. That I can see Pedro with his truck carrying stuff in the neighborhood. Maybe he moved forward with all.
Well, yeah, I would agree with you. Some people saved whatever they could and were able to purchase basically plots of land that they could not purchase, prior to being braceros. Some people were able to send their children to school, a costly endeavor in Mexico. And so there are some people who found some sense of upward mobility over and over. Like I said, they're few and far between. I spent so many years collecting and documenting bracero stories that I should not have been, my very first time entering the fields, shocked that I was entering fields in search of 70 and 80-year-old braceros. And I thought, could they still be working there? And sure enough, I found them there. I found them there laboring as undocumented workers 50 years after the end of the program. Or 40 years.
40 years. Yeah. No, I will remind our audience that we remain open to questions in that space. I'm going to ask Mireya, because it's not well known. Have you ever encountered the book called La Dilema del Retorno? It was published rather obscurely in Michoacan in Mexico. I would never have found it except I have friends at the Colegio de Michoacan. But it tells a tale. More likely, you may have heard of the taco chain called Paco's Tacos in Los Angeles. Yes. It is the tale of the family that made Paco's Tacos. And they were a family of migrants from Michoacan. And the dad came as a classic first seasonal worker, broke away, spent his life in a furniture factory, but with no goal but to go home and buy a house on the square in the town. And he did okay. While he's doing that, his wife, and partnership with their oldest son, founds a single taco stand called Paco's Tacos. And they build that single stand into a chain of several restaurants in LA. I've actually never been, but I periodically run into people and they say, oh yeah, I've been to Paco's Tacos. The irony is the family became defined by the tension. He felt like he succeeded and had to go home. Mom and the son were absolutely certain they had built the lives they wanted and they wanted to stay in LA. And the ending for this, almost too perfect for the week of the Winter Olympics. The younger daughter went into the California figure skating junior world, ended up on a California figure skating team, ended up going to competitions in Europe, etc. And how will I put it ever so politely? In the end, the family stayed together by splitting. They bought the house on the square, dad went home, and the rest of the family visited when appropriate. Mom and son built Paco's Tacos into something very successful. And the book ends before we know the history of the daughter beyond her experience in junior figure skating. But I know it's a story that's not typical, but it's, to me, revelatory of what we will say the gender tensions too.
Definitely. Definitely. And that's also a common story of migrant longing for return, for that successful return, and to also return to communities where you see yourself connected and part of those communities. And by that, I don't mean that these immigrants don't have communities in the US, but I do think that, when I talk to many immigrants, they basically don't see themselves as a part of a sort of national community in the US, that they are welcomed, that they are, included. And so they basically hold on to these communities that they have that are really grassroots, family-based, or neighborhood-based, in light of the fact of feeling excluded from something bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. And while we had our chat, we have a new array of questions. So that intervention worked just fine. From Andrew Ross, to what extent did indigenous folks from Mexico in either the teens, 20s, the Bracero program, or the H-2A program, did they come and participate? Did employers categorize them as monolithically Mexican, or was the labor of indigenous people particularly sought after or avoided?
So I actually write about indigenous people in my book, Defiant Braceros. I dedicate a whole chapter on indigenous communities that came to the US as braceros. And I mean, it was a part of a larger project in the basically from the Mexican state, to basically not only quote unquote, modernize indigenous communities, but also to teach them this agricultural technology and to labor in the US. Ironically, being in the US was supposed to be make them better Mexicans upon their return to Mexico, which I always think is this head scratching moment. I'm constantly looking then both in the H-2A program, in the first Mexican guest worker program, for those indigenous voices. And it is really challenging, especially when you think about 1917 and the kind of historical material that I'm able to basically look at and uncover indigenous voices. I think one of the keys, at least to my work in the Bracero program, was not only oral histories in indigenous communities, but also following this trail record of the coded language of indigeneity. And so communities that were indigenous were often called very awful things, primitive and backwards, and those were signs of indigeneity. So sometimes when people said in a historical document, it's because he was primitive, he spoke something else, I know that they're talking about indigenous communities in a very derogatory way, but they're talking about them. In 1917 and 18 and 19, I'm yet to find those kinds of records, but I sure am keeping my eye out for them, in part because I do think that these communities were on the move. Indigenous communities were on the move then too. I believe firmly, especially border indigenous communities were on the move. And to track those down is going to be a big challenge, but I think I'm up to it. Let's see if I can. We'll see. We'll see in about a year or two whether I'm able to.
Thanks. From Paul Angel, perhaps Angel, thank you for this amazing presentation. You mentioned that the workers who were part of these programs were overwhelmingly from Mexico. I can't remember the number, but it was upward of 90%. Where else did workers come from? Were there any other countries that the programs targeted?
For the H-2A program, the other large community that gets pulled in for guest worker visas are people from the British West Indies, which means Jamaica, Bahamas. The basically H-2 program was initially started in the 1940s to allow basically this recruitment to happen on the East Coast. East Coast growers were not employing braceros. They were employing workers from the British West Indies, and they were employing workers from Puerto Rico. And so they tried to address their labor needs in other ways. The reality is, after the Bracero program came to an end, Mexican guest workers started finding their way into the H-2 program. And then eventually the H-2 program gets split into two categories, H-2A and H-2B. H-2A is for agriculture. H-2B is basically for folks that have special skills. So believe it or not, our Silicon techies, H-2B workers, have a relationship to braceros and to these Jamaican guest workers because they are allowed to come into the US and recruited to come into the US as guest workers. And they are also highly vulnerable group because employers can literally terminate their contracts whenever they see fit. So the other large industry that relies on the other category that wasn't shown in that graph, the B, would be Silicon Valley. Believe it or not, other folks in hospitality also attempt to use the B and expand that category for other industries such as hospitality. So for as much as certain politicians dislike Mexican immigration, they will still bring in H2 workers to work in their, basically in their companies.
Yeah. Thank you. From Millie Lagraine. Apparently, the Mexican government kept some of the wages of the braceros. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I actually wrote another chapter on that in Defiant Braceros. I actually was debating today whether or not to present on my book Defiant Braceros, but every once in a while you got to change it up and talk about the new things you're working on. But in Defiant Braceros, I actually write an entire chapter on basically the Bracero justice movement, which is a movement to recuperate the 10% of the back wages withheld from braceros. 10% was withheld and placed into savings account that was supposed to be given to them upon their return to Mexico, like an incentive to return and to not skip out on your contract. What happens with that money is that during the during the aughts and the early 2000 teens, basically braceros start demanding access to their savings. Their children, their wives start asking for the recuperation of their back wages. And this back wage case actually represents the largest back wage case in the Americas. Think about it, 10% of their wages, 4.5 million contracts, that's a lot of money. And so they mobilized, and they first attempted to sue Wells Fargo, that was the bank that held the money in the US. And they in fact proved that they had transferred the money to the Mexican government. And like they say in Mexico, se lo bailaron. Governments danced it away. And there was no more money to be had for these guest workers. And basically in 2000, I want to say, I can't remember the date off the top of my head. I want to say in 9, 10, and 11, the Mexican government begins to do something because they are tired of these old men, their families, and their entire community standing up for them and protesting all over Mexico, demanding these back wages. They decide to set up what they call una compensación social, a social compensation, a small amount, not admitting any wrongdoing, to help these men in their elderly years and to help those who have deceased braceros with some kind of compensación. They gave them a standard lump sum. I think it was 3,500 or 2,500. I wrote that a whole long time ago. As you can see, I can't remember very well, but the onus of proving that these workers were in fact braceros was placed on the braceros and their families. Very few people could actually get access to it. The government simply said, well, we can't take your word for it that you were braceros or that your father was a bracero. And so, I mean, this has represented a really devastating struggle for a lot of these braceros who are now those who are active are super elderly. And one bracero said something to me that constantly breaks my heart when I think about it. He said in an oral history, están esperando a que nos moramos. Like, they're waiting for us to die. They're waiting for this issue to be forgotten so that we can be forgotten. And it makes me very sad because in many ways, as I started doing my research on the Bracero program and looking for scholars in Mexico doing this research or historians, what we found in 2003, 4, 5, that there was not a huge community of scholars on that side that were doing work on this topic. There was one who had written something on the first Bracero program, and a couple other, but not a significant, huge community that was connected. And so one of the things that I'm super happy about my research and my work in public history and building basically the largest repository of Bracero oral histories is that we brought this issue to light for many people in Mexico. And so now there are basically entire colloquiums and symposiums dedicated to studying this time period. And I gotta say, I think it's partly because a lot of Latino historians in the US were doing the heavy lifting and doing this work here to say, this is important, this is important, this is important.
Thanks. And it is, if I may punctuate. From Tim Newfield, our Georgetown history colleague. Thank you for your wonderful talk, Mireya. Could you say more about the evidence you've come across for the 1918 influenza pandemic?
Yeah.
You mentioned it briefly Is there evidence for influenza in the migrant labor population and or concern on the part of migrant laborers about being exposed to influenza in the US? It strikes me that this is an aspect of the great pandemic that has not been studied in any way.
So yes, I've come across documents where folks that are inspecting housing are very concerned. I've come across documents where basically these migrant quarters are very, very tight, and especially in places like Colorado and colder beat areas. What happens after the picking season is that many of these employers want to keep these employees basically not so far so that they don't have to pay for transportation fees, even if they don't want to also feed these people and provide heating and house these people fully. So they're kind of in limbo during the winter. And during the winter, many folks that go and inspect these camps basically write about the fear that that Spanish influenza will spread in these camps. And some actually say it already has. So some of the accounts are about the reality that influenza had already spread. Some of the accounts also mention death of farm workers because of the Spanish influenza. These are small, tight quarters, and they're really trying to cram sometimes double or triple the occupancy in these quarters. Sometimes these are makeshift tents, makeshift homes. They're often called boxes, and they're not box carts because they're so makeshift. And so I think the cold coupled with the lack of ventilation, the tight housing, they all get written about as factors that really spread influenza.
And I'm going to do a quick note there and say the death from the Spanish flu in Mexico was enormous there and not very well counted. But there are these statistics cited that Mexico lost 1 million people in the decade of the revolution, 10 to 20. But most of the good evidence suggests most of the dying came from Spanish influenza. It killed more than the revolution. So it's really an issue.
You know what I also think is interesting is that, as COVID unfolded, I basically touched base with some of my favorite people who work with farm workers in North Carolina. And they were also saying that the tight living quarters made it so that COVID was spreading like wildfire. And I heard very, very tragic stories that, gas workers and farm workers were making a pact that if anybody came down with a cough, they'd basically have to sleep outside because they weren't going to risk spreading COVID in their trailers to the remainder of the farm workers. And I found that horrifying because I thought to myself immediately, to be sick and to be told you should sleep outside.
These are the intersections of these horrid social relations and diseases.
Yeah,
and
but it's
people
also
who don't have access to care.
Yeah, and it's also a repeat in that we see this play out again 100 years later with these communities.
Yeah. We have another question from Diana Neria. What obstacles did Braceros face against racism and segregation? As temporary workers, do you think they felt the social effects of racism as much as Mexicans living permanently in the US?
Yeah, they definitely felt it. I mean, they felt the segregation in Texas. My uncle, went on record with a great story of basically being told no dogs, no Mexicans in this establishment. But moreover, after he tried to purchase a cup of coffee and he was told he could not, he was basically grabbed, kicked, and pushed out. And so he definitely understood very quickly that being a bracero was not something that was welcomed in these communities. I mean, for basically socializing and mixing. And so, I mean, places like Texas were blacklisted for several years because of the segregation that braceros experienced. In places like Arkansas, they could also experience segregation. And it was interesting in Arkansas that they'd at times stand on the Black side of the color line, and sometimes not necessarily on the white side of the color line, but establishments, especially businesses, would have Mexican hours where Mexicans can come in and purchase and buy and not mix with the regular customer base, but clearly also not be accepted as their regular customer base. And so you'd find braceros also basically moving into leisure spaces of basically Black communities where they found that they could more freely move into those leisure spaces than, say, for instance, into white spaces. And so they learned very quickly. And it was the one rule about the Bracero program is that there are no rules, in that every region, every geography is slightly distinct. And so the way things play out in Arkansas and in Texas is very different, say, for instance, in the way they play out in California or even in Michigan.
Thanks. And Diana then did a follow-up, which is pretty direct, and I think I can just quickly answer it. Where can I find your book? And my answer is going to be, I hope it's in the Georgetown bookstore, but I know it's on Amazon and easily available. And I will add, yes, buy the book, read the book. It's much worth the engagement. Quick question from Ruben, actually a comment, Ruben Hernandez Leon, who will be presenting in 2 weeks. Bracero remittances also finance migration to the cities in Mexico, and to that extent, social mobility within Mexico.
Definitely. I mean, the remittances also, I mean, they finance all kinds of projects. And, you know, when we talk about the Bracero period, we can think about the remittances and what they did to transform these communities. But in later years, the Mexican government does a lot more to formalize programs that encourage remittances towards public works projects, right? And so, you know, in places like Michoacan, the government basically by the 90s says, if immigrants send in X amount of remittances, we will match it for a road project, a school project, or this project and that project. Makes you scratch your head and say, really, do all these projects have to be financed by Mexicans abroad?
An interesting, we do shared financing, but it's usually state, local, and federal governments, not remittances and government. Thanks, Ruben. From Claudia Cortez Reinhardt, thank you for your enlightening presentation, Mireya. My name is Claudia Cortez, native of Sonora, Mexico. Is there anything that can be done to find the records from Wells Fargo and restart the issue of Bracero's wages back into investigation?
Well, the reality is that Wells Fargo indeed proved that they had gone to the Mexican government. Now, the bigger question is, how do you hold the Mexican government accountable? And for the most part, they basically did a small payout and they washed their hands of this issue and said, we did it. It was very limited. It was very, very, very small in scale and scope and time period. Another personal story, I actually had to send my uncle to Mexico to sign up for these remittances. And the reason why I did that, despite the fact that he scratches it, he's like, you know, we're going to spend $1,000 to get not much money. And I said, yes, but it's the principle here, I told him. It is the principle. And, you know, it was very difficult for me to hear when he went out there to sign up for his, basically, his back wages, which were now compensación social, which weren't really recognized as back wages. He also had to stand in long lines with elderly people that did not have great facilities, great, you know, places to stop, eat. You just stood in line. And so for him, it was really difficult to access his small monetary compensación social, as it was for many people across Mexico and in the US. It was just very difficult. And I don't think that the Mexican government is actually interested in reopening this issue. I mean, but who's to blame them? I mean, they basically got caught and now it's like, you know.
Quickly, we have two thank yous, one from Claudia Cortez, another one from Tim Newfield. And I will move to another Georgetown colleague, Catherine Donato, who asks if you could speak a bit more about gender and how it operated in, you know, as within the early 20th century agricultural workers and then mid-century braceros.
Definitely. I mean, one of the biggest shifts is that you no longer see women and children. I'm really interested in exploring the stories of these women and these children in the fields, because they essentially were the first Mexican guest workers, along with men, sure, but they're definitely an untold story. And now, as basically the H-2B visa process and other H-2 programs emerge, women are actually being recruited as H-2 workers in particular industries like the seafood industry, like crabbing. And so I think this is a great moment to return and think about their role in their original first guest worker program, and look at the ways they not only faced the limits and the obstacles put on them by employers, but the ways they actively pushed back. Um, I'm a labor historian. I like to see, them in relationship to their families, but I also like to see them in relationship to their employer, and to see what kinds of things they could do and what they couldn't do. For the most part, I get very excited when I realize that they had moments of pushing back, that they actually didn't accept the terms of their contracts, that they actually basically mobilized, and that they too, like braceros, use the ultimate kind of protest. And the ultimate protest of a guest worker is to become a skip. And that is basically to say, I will break the terms of my contract, and I'd rather be undocumented than work for you. And so they too practice skipping and breaking the terms of their contract.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah.
And we now have a question from Marcella Harden, who I'll share with everyone is the graduate assistant who's been working hard to put all of these programs together. And in her spare time is a doctoral student studying migration from Central America through Mexico to the US. Can you talk a little more about your role as an expert witness? How did you use your skills as a historian? A little professional guidance here.
Yeah. I mean, I was surprised by the phone call. It's like that moment where someone says to you, can you do this for us? Step into this role. And for the most part, I hadn't seen how what I knew about the Bracero program could help find justice for H-2A workers. But I then realized that the core issue is that these guest worker programs all fundamentally function the same way. Better employers have better results, but this is left to the devices of employers of basically saying, are they going to be fair employers? And for the most part, when they don't have to be fair employers, they actually aren't. And so I was able to use my skill in oral history. I was able to basically talk to these individuals. They were all residing in Mexico, so I had to learn how to use the latest technology in Mexico that maybe y'all know, WhatsApp. And other means to communicate and to make direct phone calls with these men and talk about what they had experienced. I took basically the affidavits and I asked similar questions, but I also asked more questions that I thought could lead to better clarity about their limits. I wanted to know, okay, so when you went into town, how often did you get to go into town? Because again, limiting a person's mobility is definitely one of those mechanisms used by guest worker programs to really hold them in these sites. And so I was able to ask about housing. I was able to also ask about the treatment of middle management. And although we say growers in agribusiness, it isn't this, bad employer who comes down and says, all of you, will leave now. It's actually a whole slew of middle management. And the middle management is often Latinx. The middle management is bilingual. And the middle management is harsh at times, can also take on, modes of racism and talk about these workers' racial backgrounds disparagingly. It can also basically be, really abusive, really abusive. So, the things that I, quoted were more mild, but, these workers faced verbal abuse constantly, because for the middle management, the verbal abuse in their eyes makes these workers work faster. And the more production, the better they look as management.
Thank you, Mireya. And let me thank all of our participants, all those who helped us put it together. Let me remind all, this will be up as a recording in about a week, hopefully a little less, and invite you all to return a week from today when I will step aside from the role as moderator and take on the challenge of presenting on some of the macro developments that lurk in the background of some of these more important human conversations in many ways, I will say. And I will also advertise that as I step out of the moderator role, Alejandro Werner, the incoming founding director of the Americas Institute, will join us in the moderator role. So again, thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you on next Wednesday evening. Thank you, Mireya, again.